And I regret to say that although there are people in SA who know far more about it than me, I haven't yet prevailed on them to write the definitive history of the pastoral country, which is a great shame, because, as I hope to illustrate tonight, it's a region, it's a major portion of the state, it's 80-85% of the state, however you do your calculations, very large portion of the state, which has been strangely neglected by historians. When you consider the colourful history of it, as I say, a strange, troublesome question, why haven't we got more history? Which is not to say that we don't have good historical studies of the region. I'll just mention several of them at the outset. There have been a number of regional studies done, of course, and over 30 years ago, Hans Minsham really prepared an exemplary regional study of the Flinders Ranges with The Story of the Flinders Ranges, not exclusively a pastoral story, of course, but pastoralism looms very large in it, and it really is a model of how the history of a particular region should be written up. Individuals have written family histories as well, and one of the more recent ones, of course, is Margaret Raglas's Dust Storms in China Teacups. Margaret will be well known to members of the Society, and the Raglas family, of course, had extensive pastoral interests. Raglases still are in the pastoral country, of course, and although it's not exclusively dealing with the pastoral country, there are some excellent cameos and vignettes there on the early days of pastoralism there. There have been company histories as well. There have been major pastoral companies active in the region. Beltana Pastoral Company many years ago published a history of its company's activities in there, and there have been others as well. Perhaps the most important recent study, which I want to draw your attention to, and I was hoping that some copies would be available for sale tonight, but the gentleman who was going to sell them I don't think has appeared, and this is a history of the Pastoral Board of SA, released only earlier this year by Peter Donovan, again a name well known in historical circles in this state, and well known, I would say, to a lot of people in this room. Peter has written a splendid history of the Pastoral Board. The history of the Pastoral Board, of course, is not the definitive history of the pastoral country. There is lots more to the pastoral country in the Yarra than the Pastoral Board, but nonetheless, it is really quite the most comprehensive study which has appeared to date, and I can thoroughly recommend it. Furthermore, it sells for a song. So this is a promo for the night. The commercial is now over. So really, summing all that up, I don't claim to be an expert. What I'm going to give you tonight is one person's view of what might best be described as the environmental history of the pastoral country, because as the President noted in his introductory remarks, I do have that strong environmental background and interest, and I will give the talk tonight, that environmental bent. So I think without further ado, I'll start showing you some of the slides, and essentially I'll talk to the slides, but I'll intersperse it with a fair bit of commentary along the way. Thanks, Rob. George Goyder, the man who appears in the title of this talk. Born in 1826 in the UK, studied surveying and engineering in his teens and emigrated to Australia at the age of 22, 1848. He actually was in Sydney initially, but after 2 years he moved to SA. 1850 he came over to SA. A year later he joined the Crown Lands and Survey Department, what later became the Lands Department, or the Department of Lands. It's had various manifestations and various name changes over the years. It no longer exists. In fact, one of the oldest government agencies in the state was absorbed into the Environment Department only a few years ago. So it's gone as an entity, but it was a very powerful and very influential government agency for, you could almost say, 150 years of settlement in this state. And Goyder joined it in 1851, a year or so after he'd arrived in SA. 1851 was a signal year for him in many ways. Not only did he join the Lands Department, which he stayed with for the rest of his working career, but he married in that year. He married Mary Frances Smith, and out of that marriage came 9 children, not all of whom survived to adulthood. But I'll say a little bit more about his marriage to Frances Smith a little later on. Goyder was an extraordinary man, and he very early in his career in the department stamped his energy, his character, his rigour on that agency. In fact, so impressive was he that within a couple of years of joining the department, he'd been promoted to the position of Chief Clerk of the Land Office, which perhaps doesn't sound significant, Chief Clerk, but it actually was. It was a very influential position within the agency. And by 1857, he'd been promoted to Assistant Surveyor-General. And by 1861, he was in fact Surveyor-General of the State. And Surveyor-General of the State in those days was an extremely powerful position, bearing in mind that the prosperity of the state was going to largely depend for many, many years on its agricultural industry, its primary production. The controlled release of land for agriculture and the development of the state was enormously important, and the Surveyor-General was second probably only to the Governor in terms of power, influence, prestige and importance in the state. And Goyder, within a relatively few years of joining the department at quite a young age, was Surveyor-General. And he was extremely energetic. Almost from the day he took on the job, he set about reforming the department. It had been rather ponderous and rather clumsy in a lot of its procedures until Goyder arrived, and he immediately started reforming the whole approach to the rural cadastre of the state, the way the hundreds and the counties were laid out, the way the sections were surveyed, the way the townships were laid out, the way the railways were integrated into the settlement pattern. He was indefatigable. He was just enormously influential and vigorous. He was variously nicknamed the King, Little Energy. He had all sorts of names. He was a fairly small sort of character, but he had this almost boundless energy and this great commitment to rigour and precision, perhaps reflecting not just the temperament of the man, but also his surveying and engineering background. His creation of or his demarcation of the line of rainfall came about in 1865, and I'll talk a little more about that shortly. Let me just go on and tell you a little bit more about his career, though. He was active not only in reforming our whole approach to rural settlement from the day he took office as Surveyor-General, but he was also active in almost every other field of significant endeavour in relation to the state's early settlement history. For example, he was first chairman of the Forestry Board when it was established in the 1870s. He was active in initiating the very early drainage of the southeast of the state. He was active on a whole range of learned societies and active in a whole range of institutions. It's extraordinary, really, in almost every branch of activity in the state throughout the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, you will find Goyder's name indelibly stamped on those activities. Of course, he was also important in the early survey of the Northern Territory. A giant of a figure, a colossus who strode across the South Australian scene in the second half of that 19th century. He didn't have an entirely trouble-free career, and his family life was dogged by tragedy in its own way, which I'll talk about in a moment. He actually tried to resign on several occasions. He got very frustrated. A man of such energy and vigour, you can imagine, would get frustrated. Bearing in mind the instability of government in these early years of settlement, Goyder served under an enormous number of ministers and ministries. Government in those years was quite unstable, although some observers have suggested that in fact heightened Goyder's powers. As a senior bureaucrat, the instability in some ways just underscored the importance of the continuity of his occupation of the office. Ministers came and went with monotonous regularity. Goyder just went on and on. You may find some parallels there with Yes Minister. The relationship of senior bureaucrats to their minister is, of course, an interesting one, but that's not the topic of my talk tonight. I mentioned that Goyder's family life was to be dogged by tragedy. I mentioned that his wife had borne a relatively large number of children, and her health failed. There's some suggestion that she was suffering from depression, and that may well be the case. Goyder sent her and the children back to the UK in the late 60s for an extended holiday. But shortly before she was due to return with the children to SA, she overdosed on laudanum, which is an opiate, a medicine with a heavy opium content in it, and she died as a result of that overdose, which again would point to profound depression as perhaps the cause of her illness and the reason that she was sent back to the UK. There was an extraordinary breakdown in communications, and Goyder didn't find out about her death, in bearing in mind the state of shipping and the mails in those days. And then the letter detailing her death and advising Goyder of it didn't get to him until after the notice of her death appeared in the Advertiser of the day. So Goyder actually learnt about her death by reading it in the Advertiser, which of course, well, there is no record of his reaction to that, but I guess we can well imagine what effect it had on him. His wife's sister, Ellen, brought the children back to Australia after some little time, and Goyder developed quite a fondness for her and quite an attachment for her, and actually wanted to marry her. But the laws of the state at that time actually forbade marriage in that situation, and it's perhaps a measure of the influence of the man that he had in effect, the law was changed to accommodate Goyder. By 1871, the statutes of the state had actually been amended to allow marriage in this situation, and Goyder married his first wife's sister late in 1871 and had a further 3 children by her, I think twin daughters and a son, if my memory serves me correctly. So in spite of his vigorous career, the fact that he was away from home for very long periods of time, nonetheless he sired a large family, but the strains that put on the family were clearly very significant indeed. Goyder retired in, I think it was 1893 or thereabouts, just before retiring, or no, some years before retiring. In fact, I think it was 1879, he purchased Warrakilla, which was the old Wheatsheaf Hotel on the road beyond Mylor up in the Adelaide Hills. A number of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with Warrakilla. It's still there. Goyder made extensive additions to Warrakilla. He clearly had retirement in mind, and he developed it as something of a model farm. And you can read about it in George Sutherland's book, Our Inheritance in the Hills. Up in the back of that there's a rather fine section describing the model development, the model irrigation, the model drainage works and so on that Goyder engaged in at Warrakilla. Retired in the early 1890s, died in 1898. I think at the age of 72, if my arithmetic serves me correctly. So that's really just a thumbnail sketch of the man, enormously important. I talked about beyond Goyder's line, and let me now just talk about Goyder's line of rainfall. This is Goyder looking for his line of rainfall, as parodied by a satirist of the day. Goyder out on his beaten up old nag, gazing through his field glasses looking for the line of rainfall. No one was sacred to the satirists of the day, be they cartoonists or people bursting into print. This is rather interesting. This is Goyder's actual report to, or the original, or a portion of the original of Goyder's report to Parliament. He had been asked, in fact, the origins of this line, the so-called Goyder's line of rainfall, go to the Great Drought of 1865, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But Goyder was requested to, or required, directed, to go north and to, from his inspection, his northern inspection, lay down on a map the southern limit, to demarcate on a map the southern limit of the great drought that was prevailing in the pastoral country from about the period 1864 through to 1867. And he did that very precisely. He rode northeastwards to roughly Swan Reach on the River Murray. From there he went north and northwest up through Burra, up to Cachowla. He went across to Peekina, near present-day Orroroo. He then went west across to Melrose, Mount Remarkable. He actually went up to Kanaka from there, between Corn and Hawker. He then went across to the Gulf, west of the Ranges, and down to roughly where Crystal Brook is today, across to Clare and back to Adelaide. Something like 3,000 odd miles he rode in that period of time, closely inspecting the country. And on his return, he wrote this report, which was subsequently published as a parliamentary paper, and accompanying it was his line. Now, his line is interesting because originally it occupied only the sort of mid and upper north portions of the state. It did not include that extension across into the Murray-Mallee, nor did it initially include that west coast Eyre Peninsula line. But they were extrapolations that were done in the office. Goyder did not visit Eyre Peninsula as part of this inspection, nor did he visit the Murray-Mallee. He was confined solely to that northern area, that mid-northern and upper northern part of the state. There are a lot of myths about this line, myths that have developed over the years. Probably the most common myth is that it was laid down as the northern limit of agriculture. It was nothing of the kind, at least initially. As I've indicated to you, it was very, very specifically the southern limit of the 1864-67 drought. Another myth is that Goyder drew it by observing the southern limit of the saltbush and bluebush country. Again, that's not correct. If you read the parliamentary paper, if you read his original report, and I will actually read an extract of it a little later, you'll see that that was not how he laid down the line. It has also been suggested, a number of people labour under the belief that it's the 10-inch rainfall isohyet, and that's how Goyder in fact laid it down. Apart from the fact that they did not have any rainfall records to speak of at that time, it's very definitely not the 10-inch rainfall isohyet. It's the rainfall of that line is quite a bit higher in terms of annual average than 10 inches. So one needs to be careful. There are these myths that have grown up around the almost legendary line, and you need to remember its origins. Its origins are very firmly rooted in the pastoral occupation and the Great Drought of 1864-67. It is true that subsequently the line came to be widely accepted, even by Goyder, as a rough indication of the safe limits of agriculture. And in fact, most people these days understand it to be that. But that was an evolutionary development that came over a period of time. It's interesting too that if you go back through, this I believe is the original plan from consultation with people like Bill Marchant and Ross Thompson who knew the Lands Department records backwards when they worked there. This they believe is the original plan that Goyder put his line on and that the extrapolations came later. It's interesting too that they pointed out that the line was smoothed over a period of time. If you compare this line, with some of the later versions, it's very clear that some of the drafting people just couldn't resist the temptation to smooth the curves. And there has been this subtle change in the configuration of the line over time. One of the interesting things is that the line still is in many circles revered, and in fact it still appears on modern day maps. This is our department's current map of the pastoral and agricultural areas of the state, or at least a portion of the agricultural areas. I can only show a portion of the pastoral country because of the nature of it, but you will see that red line there is indeed Goyder's line. And it's no small tribute, I guess, to the nature of the man, the nature of his observations and the importance of that line, that we still choose to put it on our modern day maps. This little diagram here will demonstrate a couple of sort of points of definition which I need to make at this point. Just have a look at the legend. I want to make the point that agriculture in this state only occupies the southeastern portion of the state. That shaded area, the legend, I think is clear enough. I won't wander away from the microphone to talk to the screen, but I think you can see from the legend there that shaded area occupies only about 15% of the southern part of the state. Far and away, the bulk of the state is in fact occupied by pastoral country, Aboriginal lands, and now national parks and conservation parks, and more of that later. However, there is a rather interesting transitional zone. Clearly, with rainfall and soils and vegetation, we don't suddenly see an end to agriculture and a beginning of pastoralism. There is a transitional zone. And that transitional zone in SA is known as the marginal country, the marginal lands. I'm going to talk a little bit about the marginal lands because, just coming back to this one, if you look at Goyder's line there and take the green country, that sort of orangey country, beyond the green, the pale green, olivey green there, is pastoral country. But if you look at the area between Goyder's line and the beginning of the pastoral country, that's roughly the marginal lands, our so-called marginal lands. These are the lands beyond Goyder's line that are not pastoral, they are still cropped, but the rainfall is steadily declining and the success or failure of cropping depends on the vagaries of rainfall in any given year. You will succeed or fail with your crop according to the vicissitudes of the year. So that's the marginal lands, and I now want to say a little more about them. In the mid and upper north, I guess this is a reasonable representation of our marginal lands. They tend to occur in hilly country, north-south trending ranges with fairly broad intermontane valleys between the ranges. The valleys themselves were originally more or less clear of vegetation. They were covered with perennial tussock grassland, native tussock grasslands. There was woodland on the slopes and the crests of the ranges, but that would be a reasonable artist's representation of the marginal lands in the mid and upper north, what they must have looked like originally. The marginal lands can, of course, grow very good crops of wheat and barley, and even in good years, some of the other cereals and legumes. But it depends entirely on how good the rainfall is, and when it's good, it can look as good as this. Very impressive indeed. And when it's not so good, the country can indeed display the ravages of time. In fact, this northern country, the mid and upper north of the state, has had a fair hammering from an environmental point of view over the years. It was used for pastoralism before it was used for cropping, and some of the land use over time has not been kind to it, as you can see from this type of erosion gully. The other area of our marginal country, our marginal cereal cropping, of course, is in the mallee lands of Eyre Peninsula and the Murray Mallee. And that too is country which has come in for some fairly harsh treatment as a result of European settlement. Many people would now argue that we should never have developed much of our mallee country, particularly out on the dry fringes. The soils are very sandy, prone to erosion, the rainfall is very low, and until the state introduced clearance controls in 1983, clearance was continuing apace. This photograph was taken as recently as 1981 in the Murray Mallee. And of course it's a matter of history that whilst the mallee can produce good crops too, Eyre Peninsula, for example, produces something like 40% of the state's grain in a good year, it's also true that if the drought's severe, the country will look like this. This is cropping country near Loxton. This is near Wonka in the northern Murray Mallee. A very severe drought, granted, 1967, the end of a 3-year spell of drought, 1965-67. But this type of scene is by no means unusual. It has been repeated many years in the marginal lands of Eyre Peninsula and the Murray Mallee. Because this country, both in the mid and upper north and in the Murray Mallee and on Eyre Peninsula, is indeed very marginal for cropping, particularly out on the edges, we have in fact seen a marked change, structural change in the nature of farming and the number of people earning their living from farming in this country. And since the 1930s, when the state and government combined to try and prop up agriculture, to try and rationalise farming up there in this country, we've seen the population halve or more than halve in that period of time, and we've seen farm sizes double or triple or even quadruple in size depending on the region. And that process of structural change is still shaking out. It is not yet over. It's a free market situation now in that there is no direct government intervention in the process, as there was throughout the 30s, 40s and into the 50s and 60s, but nonetheless that process of structural change within agriculture there is ongoing. And of course that impacts on the towns of these regions. It's not just the marginal nature of the country, of course, it's also changing technology. It's the sealing of roads, it's the introduction of fast modern transport. People now do their shopping in the bigger regional centres, and little stores like this are by and large fading out. The schools have been closed down in many cases, area schools put in their place. School children bust into the area schools from the outlying districts and so on. So there's a whole process of social and economic change which is still going on in this marginal country. However, I don't really want to dwell tonight on the marginal agricultural country. I want to move beyond that. I've talked about it because it is beyond Goyder's line and it is part of any story of the land beyond Goyder's line. But I really want to talk about the arid, the pastoral country, the land beyond the limits of cropping. And I want to first set the scene for you with some slides of the nature of the country. What am I talking about tonight? A lot of the country is very sandy. It's sand-rich desert country. This is the Simpson Desert, which hasn't ever really been successfully utilised for pastoralism, other than on the fringes. But nonetheless, that's indicative of quite a bit of the pastoral country. This type of sandy country is used in wide areas of the arid. Just going back there, that's what the botanists call hummock grassland. Cane grass and spinifex, sandhill cane grass and spinifex and sandhill wattles tending to dominate on those red sandy linear ridges. You also get what the botanists call tall shrubland, in some of this sand-rich country, and these are mallees and mulgas in on the edges of the Great Victoria Desert, along with spinifex, triodia in the foreground. This is low shrubland. This is vegetation which has been very, very important to our pastoral industry. Salt bush in this case, but in many other areas, blue bush. This is actually out on the Nullarbor Plain, country which has been used for pastoralism in the past, but pastoralism is no longer practiced out on most of the Nullarbor now. But this is fairly characteristic of a fair bit of the pastoral and arid country of the state. There's also woodland, low open woodland. This is black oak, again on the edges of the Great Victoria Desert, but there is country like this over extensive areas of the pastoral country, north of the River Murray and east of Burra, Tarawi, Kachala, Pandapa, areas like that. And of course the stones. One can't talk about our arid country without talking about the Gibbet tableland. Old erosion surfaces from elevated landscapes of the geological past, heavily weathered down into this sort of profile, the so-called desert varnish on them, the coating of iron oxide, highly polished, glazed, sculptured by the wind, which tends to blow incessantly for much of the time in this country. Skirts iron-clad desert, and there are large areas of it up there. There's also some very beautiful riparian country, woodland fringing the watercourses. It's paradoxical, really, that in such a dry state, I mean, it's a truism, you've heard it many times before, the driest state and the driest continent, etc., etc., none of which is true, but leaving that aside. It's a paradox that notwithstanding that it is a very dry state, we do have a lot of important wetlands. And up in the northeast of the state, the Cooper and Diamantina watercourses are really quite outstanding. They have recently been found, in fact, to have World Heritage significance. They meet 3 to 4 of the significant criteria for World Heritage listing. They're not going to be listed at this stage. There is a political dimension to that issue, which I'm not here to talk about tonight, but nonetheless, they are deemed to be of World Heritage significance, and they are very beautiful. However, it would also be fair to say that many of our creeks and riverbeds in the far north look like this most of the time. They are dry. This is Pool Creek near the dog fence, for those of you who know the country between Mari and Oodnadatta. These creeks will run the proverbial banker after flood rains, but the flood rains are obviously intermittent events. That's Coolabah, right on its southern limits, and it's a very characteristic fringing tree for this riparian woodland country. I want to talk now about the settlement of the state and the pastoral development of the state. We all know that SA was settled in 1836. We also know that the concept of terra nullius, or literally land belonging to no one, ruled in those days, and the Aboriginal occupation of the country was virtually terminated, or over large areas of the state was terminated over a period of years in the course of settlement, and I'll say a little bit more about that as the talk progresses. Pastoralism was one of the first activities engaged in when the colony was settled from 1836 onwards. It was a very simple occupation to engage in. Really, you only needed 3 things. You needed the livestock, obviously, more of that in a moment. You needed pasture for them, and you needed water. And of course, Adelaide and the surrounding country, in this case Lyndoch and the Barossa Range, George Frantangus painting, was ideal because it provided, well, it didn't provide the stock, obviously, but provided plenty of native grasses as pasture and plenty of water. So within a very short space of time, flocks of sheep and cattle were being depastured out on the country around Adelaide, long before we started growing any significant area or putting any significant area into the crop. We had pastoralism. I mentioned that we didn't have stock initially, and there was in fact a chronic shortage of stock, and this led to a brief but very colourful phase of overlanding when they brought stock over from the eastern states. They tried the Coorong route, the southeast route, difficult. The waters down there are precarious, and the more favoured route, and the one that was developed and used most, was the one along the River Murray, which however brought them into head-on conflict with very powerful Aboriginal communities. The Aboriginal people along the River Murray, of course, had an extremely favourable environment, and they were a powerful confederation, if you like, of groups, and the clashes between them and the overlanders were bloody, to say the least. But that, again, is another story, and I haven't got time to go into it tonight. overlanding party getting ready to depart to Port Phillip to Adelaide, 1840. S.D. Gill has left some rather endearing watercolours of this period, and it certainly tends to lend a rather romantic flavour to it. I don't think the reality was always like that, and Gill himself perhaps acknowledges this. There is a fair gale, shall we say, blowing, and they don't look too comfortable to me. But they had other problems as well too. And of course I've mentioned already the head-on clash with the Aboriginal people along the River Murray, the overlanders. Aboriginal people certainly took sheep, there's no question of that, they speared cattle. In defence of them, it was recognised even at the time that that was probably not unreasonable from an Aboriginal point of view, bearing in mind that the native game was being driven back very rapidly, the water holes were being occupied, the native animals were being driven away, and perforce the Aboriginal people had to resort to taking the substitute animals, but of course that in turn brought them into head-on collision. That first one is called by Gill the Marauders, and this next one is a companion painting, The Avengers, and you can see very readily why that is the case. It's an unwritten, there's not a lot written about this, but a number of people in this state and elsewhere have been researching it in recent times, and there's no doubt at all that the early settlements certainly led to some, very considerable loss of life on both sides. White people were killed as well, but obviously with their superior armaments, the scales were tipped very heavily in favour of the European settlers. Wild dogs were a problem. It wasn't just Aboriginal people that took a fancy to the mutton. The dogs, they're rather interesting dogs, aren't they? They're distinctly wolf-like visage there. But nonetheless, some dingoes as Gill saw them, and you can see that they had to resort to shepherding. It was the only way to protect your early flocks from the marauding dogs. But there was an even greater threat to the pastoralists in this high rainfall country than the dogs and the Aboriginal people, and that was the farmers. There was, right from the outset, a very considerable tension between the farming community and the pastoral community, and this, of course, was not unique to SA. It was a tension which occurred in virtually every state, and of course occurred in North America as well. Their settlement parallels, or our settlement parallels in many ways, the patterns of historical land settlement over there, and it was a tension that manifested itself both on the land in terms of direct competition between the farmers and the pastoralists in the legislature, where the conditions for land settlement were being fought out and debated. It's a matter of record, of course, that the farmers essentially won, and the pastoralists were pushed out of the higher rainfall country into the areas, the lower rainfall areas that weren't suitable for farming. Some of the pastoralists hung on, of course, and established very considerable empires in their own right. Bungaree, but there were many others, Anlaby, many in the southeast, and others scattered throughout the high rainfall country. We won't examine too closely how the pastoralists came to secure freehold title of such large areas of land in what was intended to be country released for agricultural settlement, but nonetheless they did. And they established very important properties, of course. Anlaby, Bungaree, Anamar, and a number of other properties acquired in this way became significant names, of course, in the breeding and development of the merino sheep industry, not only in SA but in Australia. But essentially, the pastoralists were pushed out into the dry country. I want to look at the settlement pattern now. The beige shaded country there is unoccupied in 1850. The country that's orange or browny colour is agricultural country. You can see not a lot taken up by 1850, mainly in the Adelaide Hills and around the Adelaide Plains. And the green is pastoral country. Now note the pattern of settlement of areas under pastoralism, bearing in mind they have very precarious tenure, but bear in mind also that they were very reliant on surface waters at this stage. They had not discovered the Great Artesian Basin at this stage. They had not developed dams to any significant degree. They were really relying on surface water. So notice how closely they're hugging the River Murray. Notice that they're down in the southeast, in the well-watered country of the lower southeast. They're down on the tip of York Peninsula and around the bottom of Eyre Peninsula, and of course they're up in the Flinders Ranges where there were plenty of springs. Now that heavy reliance on surface waters, of course, had disastrous ramifications when the droughts came. And this really was the reason why Goyder was riding northwards in 1865. The pastoralists, when they occupied these areas with surface waters, were labouring under the misapprehension that surface waters really ensured that they were drought-proof. They believed that all they needed was water and all would be well. They were wrong. When the droughts came, they had plenty of water in most instances, but of course they didn't have feed. The stock literally died on the waters. They did not have widespread fencing at this stage. They were still shepherding their flocks. So they were jamming enormous numbers of sheep, thousands of sheep, on individual waters, many hundreds of head of cattle on individual waters, and of course the areas within a day's walk of the waters were therefore pretty well eaten out anyway. So when the dry years came in, there was very, very little within walking distance of the waters for the stock. And so they perished like flies. In fact, I'll read to you now what Goyder said about the country in 1865, and it will also illustrate to you how he actually laid down that line. In his report to Parliament, he says, "The result of my investigation shows the line of demarcation extending considerably further south than I anticipated. The change from the country suffering from excessive drought to that where its effect has only been slightly experienced being palpable to the eye from the nature of the country itself, and may be described as bare ground, destitute of grass and herbage, the surface soil dried by the intense heat, in places broken and pulverised by the passage of stock, and formed by the action of the wind into miniature hummocks surrounding the closely cropped stumps of salt, blue and other dwarf bushes, whilst those of greater elevation are denuded of their leaves and smaller branches as far as the stock can reach. This description generally holds good of all country upon which stock has been depastured and where the drought obtains. The change from that to where the drought has had a less serious effect being shown by the fresher and more leafy appearance of the bushes, gradually improving to those in their ordinary state, and the gradual increase of other vegetation from bare ground to well-grassed country." So that was Goyder's description of the Great Drought as he found it. And it also illustrates to you quite clearly just how he laid down that line. Let me read to you another description from early in 1865. This Hans Mincham believes is Robert Bruce, well-known figure, well-known pastoralist from the Flinders Ranges of this time. And Bruce writes, "All the country northward of Port Augusta is in a deplorable condition. Sheep and cattle in all directions dying of starvation. On several stations, some thousands of sheep are turned loose in the bush, it being impossible to shepherd them, and are there slaughtered in scores by packs of wild dogs. Very many of the flocks of sheep, which have till now been kept together, are now at the point of starvation. And should the coming winter be a late or dry one, the north must become one vast scene of desolation. As it is, there is not a blade of grass to be seen in the country, which actually stinks with the effluvia arising from the decomposing bodies of sheep and cattle." The losses were absolutely enormous. Philip Levi, a very important man of commerce and a significant pastoralist in his own right, was ruined, at least for a period of time, by the Great Drought of 64-67. He lost 50,000 head of sheep. He lost 10,000 head of cattle. John Baker lost 10,000 sheep and 1,000 head of cattle on Blanchwater. Many of Philip Levi's sheep and cattle losses were up in the Mound Springs country, which have been discovered by now. And again, it highlights the point I was making a moment ago. When they found the Mound Springs, which are natural outlets for the waters of the Great Artesian Basin, again, they thought they were drought-proof. They thought that with that unfailing water supply, they would have no concerns at all. They were wrong. As I said, the sheep and the cattle perished in their thousands. It was a very salutary experience, but it was one that was underscored many times in subsequent droughts. The 1864-67 drought was not the first, it was not the last, and it was by certainly not the last time that massive losses of livestock were recorded in that dry country, that arid country. We are still having, I suggest, a lot of difficulty in coming to terms with the fact that this is country which will always have as a normal feature of its climatic pattern drought. We still tend to talk of drought in terms of being an exception. We say it's exceptionally dry in the north, or it's unusually dry. It's not unusually dry. This is country where drought is the norm rather than the exception. Let me move on to 1890, skip a few years and jump over 30 or 40 years. You can see now that agriculture has been expanding northwards and pastoralism has also been expanding as it's being pushed out by the successful expansion of the farmers. Have a look at the little map, the little inset map down on the left-hand corner there, and you'll see that a fair area of the state is now occupied by pastoralism, the area shaded green. Simpson Desert has not been, although it's interesting that in the 1880s there was quite a lot of speculation. People were taking up paper runs and changing, and they were selling them very, very quickly. There were stocking requirements, but they were selling them on the speculative market. And at one stage, the whole of the Simpson Desert was taken up under speculative pastoral leases. Not a head of stock was put on the country, but it was all under speculative lease. And of course, fortunes were won and lost in that way. But nonetheless, the pattern of pastoralism as we see it today was starting to emerge. It subsequently was pushed out of Eyre Peninsula, but we'll have a look at that in a moment. I mentioned the impact that, and you could see from that description I read out from Goyder, that the impact of the droughts and the overstocking, and when I talk about overstocking, let me tell you that the stocking rates they were employing in those days were up to 4 or 5 times the stocking rates which we now think might be acceptable in this country. Bear in mind also that those sorts of rates were jammed onto the surface waters as opposed to the way we try and spread the sheep and cattle out in that country today. And you'll get some idea of the enormous impact and the environmental degradation that resulted from those early excesses. We shouldn't blame the pastoralists for that. It was an experiment in many ways. They didn't know the capability of the land. They didn't know the sustainable numbers that they could run. It was an experiment, but a disastrous one in many ways. The impact of the vegetation on the vegetation you can gauge from Goyder's description and Robert Bruce's description and the descriptions of many others. But the animals also suffered. This is now the well-known but endangered bilby. The bilby was just typical of many of our ground-dwelling mammals that just disappeared, just almost vanished overnight. We know that foxes, we know that rabbits, we know that feral cats can and do have a major impact on the populations of these animals. But it's also true that they disappeared from a lot of the stocked country well before, for example, the fox arrived or even the rabbit arrived. And there is no doubt, that there can be no doubt at all, that pastoralism had a very significant impact on the habitat of these animals. By and large, they relied on the bush cover and the perennial tussock grasses to provide them with both food and habitat. And of course, they were the very things that were trampled out and hammered by the stock when the country was having to support such large numbers. So over vast areas of the country, we very rapidly lost many of the species of native fauna which occurred there at the time of European settlement. And of course, settlement, pastoral settlement, agricultural settlement inevitably meant an end to the traditional Aboriginal way of life, and detribalisation was very common, particularly in the more southern and central parts of the state. Well-meaning efforts were made to try and mitigate some of the impact of European settlement on Aboriginal communities. Kalalpanina Mission, just off the present-day Birdsville tract. Many people would argue about whether it was misguided philanthropy or whether it really did help, but regardless, the mission movement was and is an important part of the story of European settlement and occupation of the dry country, and indeed of parts of the agricultural country as well. We talk about sheep being run south of the dog fence, and we talk about cattle north of the dog fence, and that's absolutely true. By and large, no one runs sheep successfully north of the dog fence now. But that was not the case until relatively recently. A lot of people believe that the dog fence has been up there in its present position for many years. Not true. Individual properties were dog fenced throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century, But it was very much an individual effort. You fenced your own property and you employed doggers to trap them, poison them, shoot them. It was only later that rationalisation and amalgamation of those individual properties, property fences, dog fences, led to the creation of the dog fence as we know it today. And in fact, the dog fence board, I think, only dates from about the 1940s, 46 or some such date like that. Don't quote me on it, but it's a relatively recent creation. So the industry was more mixed up than it is now. It didn't have that clear demarcation. In fact, sheep were running right up to the boundaries of the Northern Territory and beyond, well into the 20th century, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The romance and glamour of the sheep industry is part of our folklore, part of our mythology. Some would say essential to our national psyche, our national character, and probably no better arts icon of that than Tom Roberts' shearing of the rams, painted by him on Brocklesby Station in New South Wales, late 1880s. I think the painting was finished in 1890. It's interesting that Brocklesby was already using machine shearing. They actually went back to blades for the sake of Tom Roberts' work. And of course this was Michael Loonig's irreverent parody of this. Loonig titles this Ramming the Shears. Let's go back to that one. Back to the serious side of it. Blade shearing on Kanowie in South Australia. The quantities of sheep they put through the early pastoral sheds were just staggering. And I mentioned the stocking rates were just so many times greater than today. You just cannot believe. It's just mind-boggling to go through some of these stock returns and see the number of stock they were carrying. It's not surprising the country was hammered. Moving into the 20th century with the sheep industry, and you can see there that the machine shearing is well and truly in. This is actually from a 1921 film. Franklin Barrett, I think, A Girl of the Bush, and I guess that's the Girl of the Bush in the middle there. I'm not sure that women were actually supposed to be on the board, were they? Didn't a cry go up of women on the board or some such story? There are probably people that know more about it than me, but that doesn't quite ring true, and the fact that it's a still from a film suggests that it's probably not a typical scene, but nonetheless it does indicate the movement of the industry with the inroads of technology into the 20th century. One of the attractions of wool in the early days, this is a poor slide in terms of quality, and I apologise, a number of these slides are fairly poor quality, but you'll bear in mind that a number of them are very old, and not only that, we've had to go through a process of rephotographing them to make these slides, so there's a drop in quality from fairly poor material. So I do apologise for that. But this is interesting. This is the camel team bringing Cordillo wool down, crossing the Cooper at Inaminka. And it illustrates if you like, the portability and the durability of wool as a product for these remote areas. And that was one of its great attractions. You didn't have to move the sheep on the hook. You could take the wool off and you could pack it on your camels or your horse wagons or whatever, and it didn't perish en route. And it didn't matter if it got wet, you could dry it out if necessary, and so on. That's interesting too, in that it displays camels sort of up to their bellies in water, and a lot of early people would tell you camels didn't like water and mud, but these camels certainly weren't fazed by crossing the Cooper. This was probably in the harder country, camels were very much favoured in the sandhill country, where water was short and where the pulling was very heavy for wagons, but on the harder country, northwest of Port Augusta and up in the Udinadatta country, wagons drawn by camels, because they obviously needed a lot less water than horses, were a favoured means of moving the wool and moving the stores and goods around. I mentioned that, and again, this is a very poor quality photo that I was working from. I can't do much better than that. But it's interesting because it's sheep well out on the stones. In fact, this is up on Cordillo Downs. Now, Cordillo Downs is in the extreme northeast of the state, well beyond the dog fence, right up in dingo country, yet it ran sheep right up until the 1930s, 1940s, in fact, as did a number of other stations around Cordillo and around Udinadatta as well. Mount Dare was running sheep, a number of other properties well into the 1930s, probably into the 1940s in some cases. Very, very interesting. You can actually go up into this country today and you can find the old yards, the old bough yards, branch yards, brush yards, where they used to put the sheep at night, where they jam them in again to keep the dingo at bay. And of course they also employed, as I think I mentioned earlier, large numbers of doggers. Labour was cheap, and the doggers could go out and stiffen large numbers of dingoes, as they put it in those days. Strychnine was used extensively. And this is in fact the scouring plant on Cordillo Downs. You'll appreciate that there would have been a lot of grit and sand in the fleeces, and if they could get a fair bit of that out, obviously they were greatly reducing the weight of the wool for carting it south. So this was a steam plant powered scouring establishment on Cordillo Downs, 20th century. I want to talk briefly about the cattle industry. The cattle industry really got going once they discovered the huge quantities of underground water in the Great Artesian Basin, and they really got stuck into that from about the 1880s onwards. This was one of the early bores, Coward Springs Railway Bore, on the Mari Unadata narrow gauge line, the old GAN line. The provision of water, particularly underground water, enabled the cattle industry to expand quite dramatically, and the cattle industry in many people's minds is the quintessential use of outback Australia. Very romantic scene there, painted by Frank Marnie. The reality, of course, was somewhat different. It was hot, dirty, dusty, hard work. This is a scene on Indominka Station in the Bronco yards there. Castrating animals, branding them, hard, dirty work. The reality is they did not tend to match the glamour. But nonetheless, in the minds of, and I probably see it into our national psyche, it has been and still is in the minds of many a glamorous use of the land, a glamorous occupation. And of course the movement of beef cattle all over the country, again, has become part of our national legend. The stock route over on the left from Walloona to Halls Creek, the Canning stock route, up the top there bringing cattle from the Kimberleys across to Newcastle Waters, from Top Springs to Newcastle Waters is the Murringi track, the track down to Camberwell, across the Barclay Tableland country, down to Bullion Birdsville through the Channel country, and of course the fabled Birdsville track coming down. That map illustrates quite clearly why the Birdsville track was developed. A lot of people tend to think, if they haven't looked at their map, that Birdsville must be close to Brisbane because it's in Queensland, but you can see there that Birdsville is actually much closer to Adelaide than it is to Brisbane and the markets of the East Coast. And therefore all that cattle that was being fattened on the prime Channel country of the Cooper and Diamantina country was brought down to Maree, where there was a rail establishment, and that again has become part of our national legend, part of the romance of the Australian outback. And of course perhaps no better indication of the romance of the industry than if you pick up a catalogue. Not so many years ago, this was one of the R.M. Williams catalogues, and you can see they're almost unchanged. So it's like a time warp almost. It's the same sort of gear that they were using almost 100 years ago that was still in an R.M. Williams catalogue of probably only 15 or 20 years ago. A whole legend and mythology grew up around the Birdsville track, and I want to just digress it a little and talk about that. The Birdsville track originated as a droving route around the turn of the century. Originally they brought cattle down the Diamantina and then just really had to go for the lick of their life from where the waters of the Diamantina petered out down to Maree. They were very reliant on surface waters, and as a result they perished many large mobs of cattle. So the SA government, to tap into that lucrative Channel country market and to make it safe to bring down mobs of cattle, put down a whole series of bores down the Birdsville track around the turn of the century. And it was turned from a very dangerous track into a much safer one, which is not to say they still didn't perish mobs of cattle, they did. But nonetheless, it became a much safer route, and a much used one, right up into the mid-20th century, one of the best known and most heavily used of all the Australian stock routes. And a number of the famous names, a number of pastoralists associated with the Birdsville track, their names have passed into legend, and one of those names, of course, is the Scobies, but there's the Crombies and others. But the Scobie whip, which is illustrated here, was a special design whip made by one Alex Scobie. And probably the best way to tell you a little about Alex Scobie is to read to you a poem by Douglas Stewart, about Alex Goyder and the Scobie whip. Douglas Stewart will be well known to many of you as a major literary figure and major modern poet of Australia. It's interesting that George Goyder built considerably on the legend of the Birdsville track with the publication of his Land of Mirage in 1950. But the image, the romantic image of the Birdsville track was, I think, to be immortalised in the film Back of Beyond, the Shaw documentary, John Hyer's classic Shaw documentary film of 1952, Back of Beyond. And Douglas Stewart, interestingly enough, wrote the script for that film. And he spent quite a bit of time up on the Birdsville track and at Maree, and he wrote some rather wonderfully evocative verse about the Birdsville track as a result of his work up there in connection with the filming of that documentary. Let me read to you The Whipmaker. 1,000 miles from everywhere, north or south or east or west, where league on league the redstones glare and summer rolls in clouds of dust. With grave lean face, long fingertips, Alex Scobie sits plaiting whips. Kidman drover, station owner, till drought walked in 17. The grey walls crumble at Urwalani, the redstones bake where the dam was green. Those who tread the Birdsville track make a whip for their own back. Now in the veranda's shade, he twists the burning country in 16 strands of kangaroo hide, like a river cool and thin. When it coils in a red snake, it is not him it's meant to strike. And one more by the same poet. Place names. Etadina, Miramitta, Mulka, Mungarani. Dark shadows blown with the dust away, far out of time, fill the land with water, where the blue sky flames on the bare red stones. Dolkanina, Copperamana, Urwalani, Kilalpanina. Only the names in the land remain, like a dark well, like the chime of a bell. R.M. Williams, who I guess should know about this sort of thing, says that there was never a whip to match the Scobie whip before, and there has been nothing to rival the Scobie whip ever since. I want to talk about some of the harshness of the country for the families and the women folk. I think we tend to dwell too much on the men of the outback. Men certainly were dominant, but there were women there as well. And there's no question about that. They had a dreadfully hard time of it. The heat, the dust, the flies, the isolation must have been truly awful. Sometimes this was the best they had. I guess if they were lucky, they aspired to and eventually got this type of refinement and degree of civilisation, and she certainly looks happy with her lot in life. Towns were few and remote, travel exceedingly difficult. This is Inaminka, the Inaminka Hotel in 1890 or thereabouts. Visits to these towns were infrequent, and as a result, goods frequently had to come to the stations, and the travelling hawker loomed large in the lives of these people. And even religion came on the hook. There's a message there on the pole on the side of the donkey cart. The travelling missionary, the bush padre, again very important figures. R.B. Plowman, the man from Oodnadatta, Camel Pads, the boundary rider. A number of you will have read those books. In many ways the country, whilst it was remote however, was more closely settled than it is now. There were a lot of boundary riders, there were doggers, there were large numbers of people employed on the stations, there were lots of outstations, lots of huts. And in fact, if you read Plowman in the Bush Padre and his travelling around the countryside, he rarely camped on his own. In fact, it's quite a novel occasion, and he remarks on it in his books about when he camped alone. Mostly, he was spending the night with someone. And in many ways, that the country is lonelier now than it was perhaps 50 or 100 years ago. There has been massive depopulation, of course, with changing technology. I talked about Aboriginal people and the detribalisation of them, but they were enormously important to the pastoral industry. Aboriginal stockmen in SA, as in the other major outback areas of Australia, really carried the industry. Without Aboriginal labour, without Aboriginal stockmen, the industry would not have survived and prospered in the way it did. But we mustn't forget the Aboriginal women either, because they were very commonly employed as domestic help. This is actually up on Hermansburg, but nonetheless, Aboriginal women's labour was certainly employed on many of the SA cattle stations at this time. It wasn't all beer and skittles. Fortunes were made and were won and lost up there. This again is not terribly clear. It's from the Bulletin of 1887, with rabbits predicting the demise of the sheep and the humans by the year 1988. Rabbits, of course, overran the country in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and added enormously to the environmental pressures on the country. Things were so bad in the 1890s that a Royal Commission rode out of Adelaide, or perhaps I should say rode out of Coward Springs. They went up on the train to Coward Springs, transferred to camels and rode northwards into the remote areas of SA and into Central Australia. By the time they got from Coward Springs to Oodnadatta, they'd met and decided to increase their daily allowance from 1 guinea to 3 guineas. Such were the conditions they thought they were facing. But it's important to note that out of this 1890-91 Royal Commission came the 1893 Pastoral Act and the Pastoral Board, and that really represented the beginnings of an effective regulation of the industry, the Pastoral Board. I mean, that's the Peter Donovan history, and I'm not giving you the history of the board tonight. I mentioned that fortunes were made and lost. No talk on the pastoral country of SA or Australia generally would be complete without reference to Kidman. Something like 150 properties were traded in by Kidman, or Kidman traded in around that figure in his lifetime, and at his height his empire extended to something like 260,000 square kilometres. A very strategic purchase of holdings. He tried to drought-proof his holdings, and depending on your point of view, that was either very good for the country or an absolute disaster. I think the jury is still out. I want to talk very briefly, because time's moving on and I will wrap it up shortly, but changing technology in the 20th century, the arrival of the railways, the arrival of motorised transport really brought about enormous changes to the outback. Travel time was greatly reduced, the speed and ability to get your products to market. Perhaps symbolic of the changing times, the motorised transport on the left, the camel coach on the right, transferring it on the Srelecki track in this case, transferring from one to the other. They still had to use camels in some of the heavy sand-rich country. And of course some of the early tourists even had their problems. This is how you transferred your motor car from one side of the Cooper and Dinamenka to the other in probably the 1920s. We don't really know, but probably the 1920s. These people seem to be tourists. There's a whole series of photos of their activities in the far northeast of the state that are lovely, shot off and about to punt across the flooded Cooper Creek. And of course, coming back to the legendary Birdsville track, and Harry Ding, who established a great trucking empire which he ran out of Yunta, had the Birdsville mail contract for many, many years, and legendary figures like the great Tom Cruise drove for Harry Ding and many others. And again, that's a story in its own right. The aeroplane came to the outback. This is the first plane at Oodnadatta in 1921. Again, revolutionised the speed. The radio later, the pedal radio, and then battery-operated radios, again made an enormous difference to the sense of remoteness and isolation. The flying doctor, that's a story that's been told many times before, and I shan't dwell on it, but the times were changing very, very rapidly. This is a poor photo, but nonetheless it's interesting historically. I mentioned John Hyre's classic documentary film, The Back of Beyond. That was filmed at the height of the flooding of Lake Eyre in the late 40s, early 50s. And this is the legendary Bill Goyder's mob swimming the Cooper in 1950. Bill Goyder, one of the last of the great legendary heroic drovers of the Birdsville track. I was in 1973 at Adminga railway siding camp one night when a stock train came in on the Old Gan Railway, and we got up to see some Victoria River fats taken off, and some store cattle, no, sorry, the other way around, some store cattle came down from Victoria River, and they were putting fats on from Tyon and Adminga and Dalhousie at the siding there at about 2:30, 3 in the morning. And it turned out that Bill Goyder was the train stockman. They had a train stockman to sort of keep an eye on the stock trains in those days. May still do for all I know, although not a lot of stock are moved by train now. And I was quite taken by this because I'd read a lot about Bill Goyder, and it seemed extraordinary to me that one of these great heroic figures that I'd read about in my youth was still around and still driving stock, as it were, at least on a train, as late as the 1970s. And this, I guess, this was taken on the same trip. And I guess that in many ways symbolises what was happening at this time. It's a meeting of two cultures. It's a transition we see there. You've got the flash four-wheel drive on the right-hand side. You've got the Aboriginal stockmen still working the cattle on Anna Creek in 1973. Award wages came in for, award wages requiring Aboriginal stockmen to be paid the same as white stockmen came in 1965, but there was a phase-in period to, I think, December 1968. But of course, once they were to be paid the same as white stockmen, that aspect of the industry was living on borrowed time. And I think myself and a number of others realised that was indeed symbolic of changing times, that scene. This is much more the norm these days. Cattle are still worked and sheep are still worked with horses, but technology has moved in a big way. The stock bike, the ag bike, helicopter mustering in the Northern Territory, not greatly practised in SA, but a lot of fencing, road trains, of course, largely have taken over from movement of stock on the hoof, almost totally taken over, and so it goes on. It's a changing industry, and this really exemplifies the changes. Pastoralism, in many ways, is a contracting use in the north of the state. It is under intense pressure, and there is intense competition for the land from a whole range of other uses. These include Aboriginal traditional lands, conservation, mining, tourism, to mention only the more significant of them. The pastoral industry will not expand. It reached its limits many years ago, decades ago, and it is contracting. A number of station properties, in fact, are now conservation parks or national parks, and other stations have gone back into Aboriginal ownership. And the face of the industry is changing very, very significantly. I guess that's not surprising when you reflect on the very quick overview I've given of the industry from the earliest days of settlement. Change has been part of it, right from the word go, and whilst undoubtedly it will survive well into the 21st century, there will no doubt be many more changes, many more challenges. The industry has faced many challenges, it's faced many difficulties in the past. I've no doubt it will face many of them successfully in the future. But change there will be, and change is not necessarily a bad thing. Many of the uses of the country coming in are worthy enough in their own right. Mr. President, I think I will stop at this point, and if there are any questions or if there is any time for questioning, I'll be pleased to try and fill it.
Certainly time for questions, so would you like to address your questions to Colin?
Are there any figures of the numbers of people living in the pastoral lands sort of at the height of population?
I haven't gone back to, I'm sure there would be, the stat register, I'm sure would give you a breakdown, the SA stat register, but I haven't gone back and done that. It would be very interesting. It would be part of the definitive history, which I hope someone will write one day. I don't believe that has been done, but it would illustrate, I have no doubt, what I was suggesting, that the stations were employing many more people than they do now, and there were a whole range of ancillaries. The teamsters required to bring the wool down, the drovers to move the cattle. It really, although it was very isolated, very remote country, it was also teeming with activity and people in many ways. And it's just one of the many paradoxes that you find in that country. Kanaka was, it is, the ruins of Kanaka still remain. They have been stabilised and interpreted by Hamish's State Heritage Branch. They're on the main road between Quorn and Hawker. Extraordinarily interesting. If you haven't seen Kanaka, strongly recommend that you go and see it. One of the great stations that came to an early end as a result of the expansion of agriculture. They had this fanciful notion that wheat could be grown up in that country, and Kanaka, like a number of the big properties in that country, fell to the wheat frontier, pushing northwards. Kanaka at its height was a little town in its own right, employed something like 70 people, which again I think just sort of points to what we've just been discussing. 70 people on one station, it's quite extraordinary. If you go to even a fair-sized sheep station now, in the sheep country, you're battling to to count the number of workers on one hand. You know, the days of jackaroos, I mean, there are still jackaroos, but you know, you find that times are tough, that people can't afford to have jackaroos on the property, the cost of labour, workers' comp, all these other ancillary costs. Governesses, they're not a thing of the past, but they're moving in that direction. So the station owner's wife or partner is required to do a lot of the teaching that would formerly have been done by governesses and so on. And you can actually see this in the running down of the properties. It was very common, particularly on the old sheep stations, for the stockmen, when they were too old to actively work the stock, to be kept on the property in their retirement, as it were. And they would be yardmen around Government House, the head building. They would look after the garden, they'd chop the wood, they'd sweep the yard, and generally keep it in good nick, clean the gutters and so on. They're not there anymore. So to force the owner or the owner's sons and daughters and what have you are doing or not doing, frequently because of all the other pressures, these sorts of things. And it's, again, it's just a symptom of change and the pressures of changing circumstances, particularly changing economic circumstances in this country. Yeah. Yeah, it's a fair question. The perpetual lease situation really was a reflection of that unrealistic push northwards of the wheat frontier in the 1870s, 1880s. They surveyed a lot of country north of the current marginal cropping country in the belief that it would be suitable for agriculture, and they were wrong. It wasn't suitable for agriculture, but they had already surveyed it and alienated it to perpetual lease, as Patricia's saying. And as a result, it's actually rangelands grazing country. It's every bit rangeland grazing country. It's the country under pastoral lease, again, as she was suggesting. Intended for agriculture, mostly never used for agriculture, used for grazing instead. But because it was perpetual lease, not subject to the stocking controls and general management oversight that the Pastoral Board has exercised over pastoral leases. And therefore it's quite true that the perpetual lease country in many areas has suffered from, hopefully, mainly in the past, unchecked stocking. There has been excessive stocking of some of that perpetual lease country by comparison with the pastoral lease country. And Pat's observation is quite an accurate one. As for the future of those lands, no, there is no plan to freehold that country. In fact, Cabinet reaffirmed only a couple of months ago a policy of not freeholding rangeland grazing country, whether it be held under pastoral lease or perpetual lease. And if you pick up your current edition of the Stock Journal, the fact that it says don't believe it. It's actually a straight out mistake. They've got it wrong, which is a problem for us. They got our press release. A press release was issued saying, among other things, there will be no freeholding of rangeland grazing country, and they've written that as this freeholding offer includes rangeland grazing country, which is something that we have to manage as an agency. But no, the government has accepted that for all sorts of reasons it's not appropriate to freehold rangeland grazing country, and its freeholding policy applies only to agricultural country, only to cropping country. So I hope that sets your mind at rest, Pat. I don't think there's any doubt about that, Jock, and it's a fair comment. Of necessity, with a talk of this nature, we've been looking backwards, and it's certainly true that a lot of the excesses of the past will not, hopefully, be repeated in the future. Attitudes certainly changing for the better. There is a lot of enlightened management going on, and we'll see a lot more of it in the future. However, it would also be fair to say that not all the degradation that's a problem in the pastoral country is historical. One of the problems that you have in trying to disentangle the effect of the pastoral industry on the environment is that the data, by and large, is not terribly good. Almost all the evidence from history, if you like, is anecdotal or terribly qualitative and subjective. You know, the country was looking in good heart, or the country was smiling, tells you nothing about what was really happening to the blue bush and the salt bush and so on. And there are very, very few quantitative benchmarks that you can go back and measure change against. There are some, and the few that do exist indicate that land degradation has continued well into the 20th century. It's not purely historical. There has been a rundown of some of the chenopod shrubland in some areas into quite recent times. A lot of that is being turned around by the land care movement and by the type of enlightened management which you're referring to, Jock. There are probably still situations, however, in the pastoral country where we're dealing with sub-economic holdings in areas which might be better used or better put to other uses, and I don't want to get any more specific than that, but you know, the industry is struggling in patches. You know, the properties are very small, the number of stock can't ever be great, there are many other pressures on the land, rabbits, goats and so on, and there are other competing uses which in the long term might be a better use from a broader community point of view. But there are undoubtedly other areas, Jock, where pastoralism will remain, where it's being managed very successfully and well. An outstanding example of that is the Nicholson's cluster of properties over on Northern Eyre Peninsula, where they have been outstandingly successful in managing their chenopod shrublands, their salt and bluebush over decades. And Jock has mentioned country up in the cattle country where there is good management going on too. So you're absolutely right, and it's a good balancing perspective to put on the story. Oh, it certainly has, and is still having. The Khaleesi virus hasn't penetrated to all parts of the Arid. It's up in some of that country, but it's very early days. Of course, it hasn't been released systematically, and it's not going to be a panacea anyway. The hope is that we'll have a significant dampening effect on rabbit numbers. But no, you're absolutely right. Like any introduced successful species, it exploded. There was an ecological explosion when it got going in that country. And some of the contemporary descriptions are just horrifying. So they just consumed everything in their path, in their path, and when they'd eaten everything on the ground, they climbed the trees and stripped the trees and died up in the trees, you know, hung themselves in the forked branches of the trees as they slipped trying to get out to the last morsel on the end of the branch. So it was a truly horrifying impact, and whilst it's drawn back since then, myxomatosis was enormously successful throughout the 50s. It has attenuated to a considerable degree since then in terms of its virility, and isn't having the impact that it had. But nonetheless, that there are no longer the rabbit numbers there were at the turn of the century, but they're still there, particularly in the sandhill country of the northeast, the Streleki country, and up around the Kungi country, and elsewhere, wherever you get surface water, you get entrenched populations of rabbits, and it really is a problem, because the scale of the country up there is such that you cannot reasonably expect the pastoralists to go and mechanically control rabbits in the way they do down in the high rainfall country. In the high rainfall country, your properties are small enough that you can get out with a rabbit ripper and fumigators and so on, and really get stuck into them. But with properties of many thousands of square kilometres, and bear in mind that Anna Creek, which is the largest cattle station in Australia, is 30,000 square kilometres. It's just absurd to think that you can practice in this country the sort of intensive rabbit control you can in the farming country. So it's largely beyond the individual pastoralist control, other than attacking entrenched populations around waters in times of drought when their numbers are low anyway. It's had a deleterious impact not only on the industry but on the plants and animals as well. It's just a scourge, there's no question of it. But there are various studies which have quantified this. It's perhaps fair to say too that we should, and coming back to Jock's point, the impact of grazing pressure on this country is not just introduced stock, it's the rabbit we've just been talking about. It's also things like the kangaroo. There is not a shadow of a doubt that kangaroo numbers have increased enormously in the sheep country as a result of changes attendant to the livestock industry. There's lots more grass than there used to be. Grass has replaced bush over large areas of the sheep country. There are many more surface waters. The dingo's been cleaned out of the sheep country. Very favourable breeding conditions for the red and the grey kangaroos and the Euros. And their grazing pressure is quite significant also, not to mention goats and donkeys and brumbies and camels, and the list goes on. And so increasingly people are talking about total grazing pressure. And that's really what you have to consider. It's the whole suite of herbivores which are trying to exist off this living resource, which we have to be concerned about. And we have to get beyond emotion when it comes to things like kangaroo numbers, and accept that there's a lot of them there and they do need management like any other grazing animal. the Aboriginal communities do run stock, but at this stage not on a large scale. They tend to keep what are called killers for their own use, for the use of the community. Their entry into the industry on a commercial footing has certainly been mooted for a long time. When what's now called Armada was first established as Musgrave Park in the early 1960s, it was hoped that it would become a commercial cattle property in its own right, run by the Aboriginal people for the Aboriginal people, but it didn't develop for a whole range of reasons that way. It may be a development of the future. The Aboriginal people certainly want an independent economic base. And tourism will probably be part of that, conservation. Grazing might well be a part of it too, but at this stage it's in its infancy.
Because the state government legislated that pastoralists had to carry much more stock than the country was capable of carrying. And if you didn't carry that stock, you lost a pastoral lease.
Yes, absolutely. I'm no longer on the board. I was on the board for 8 years, and even when I was on the board, there was a feeling that if a pastoralist wasn't using a portion of the property, then that situation ought to be reviewed with perhaps a view to that area being incorporated in an adjoining lease because the country wasn't being, quote, used, unquote. I think we're moving on from that, and it's being accepted now that we ought to be thinking about multiple use, and the number of pastoralists are. I mean, given the hard economic times, a number of pastoralists are now turning to tourism and property-based holidays and recreation and so on, particularly in the Flinders Ranges and areas like that, where you've got high scenic values. And there's got to be a place in there for leaving areas of your property unutilised. There's actually a move the other way with polypiping, of course. You can take water right out now to areas that were beyond the reach of stock previously. So, I mean, that's another... I mean, there's all sorts of conflicting trends and issues here. But I do think that government, the pastoral community, the community as a whole are moving towards an acceptance of the reality that there will be a multiple use of this region in the future. We won't be traditionally talking about single purpose uses. We'll be looking at a whole suite of hopefully harmonising and compatible uses that complement each other, don't conflict.